When I bring up the subject of the Dudley Boyz, I'm sure an image like this first comes to mind. Bubba Ray, Devon, and maybe Spike. But how much do you know about the original members of the group that only appeared in ECW, and its unique backstory? In this video, I'm going to take you through the first large wrestling family that Paul Heyman was involved with. Think of it as his training for the bloodline, with a lot more tie-dye. Our story begins with the family's patriarch, the entirely fictional Daddy Dudley, who travelled the US presumably around the 60s and 70s, given the age range of his offspring, working as a salesman. Think of him as a sort of Ray Kroc figure, but spreading something else instead of milkshake machines. Big Daddy Dudley is said to have lived an interesting, to put it one way, life on the road, having fathered children across the US, but we'll get back to that in a little while. This brings up many questions as to where the fictitious Dudleyville might actually be. Really, it brings a few questions up, like why did Bubba Ray used to talk with a southern accent, but later became as New York as they come? If you Google this, you'll find a few different answers, like the actual town of Dudleyville, which is in Arizona, and they were also at one point billed from the hills of Charleston, Pennsylvania. I personally always just assumed that Dudleyville was supposed to be a bit like Springfield, in that its geography matches whatever's needed in that particular moment. Despite the origins of each forthcoming Dudley being ambiguous, they are mostly linked by the same features: glasses held together by tape, a love of tie-dye and denim, and many of the characters we're about to talk about have also been credited to Raven, Tommy Dreamer and Taz, all of whom had influence behind the scenes in ECW. Now we get to the first of the real-life Dudleys, Dudley Dudley. Real name Jeff Bradley. Trained by Dean Malenko and his father Boris, Jeff has wrestled under many names, such as Charlie Hunter, Man Mountain Kong, and weirdly, a chef character called Evil Snack. He started wrestling in 1993 before joining ECW in 95, wrestling against Taz under the Evil Snack gimmick before debuting as Dudley Dudley in his next appearance. Dudley was, in storyline, the only Dudley brother born within wedlock, and so was considered the purest Dudley. He wrestled 17 matches under the gimmick, 13 of which being losses, before leaving ECW in October of that year. From there, Bradley worked as enhancement talent for WWE and WCW, as he had done before ECW, and wrestled a fair bit for the Florida-based IPW Hardcore for the next few years. Another interesting thing to know is that post-ECW, he would be a trainer at the wrestling school of Dean Malenko. As part of this role, he would have a hand in training a young Glenn Jacobs, who went on to be Kane, Molly Holly, and ECW star Tony Mamaluke. He also helped train the Johnsons, the skin-coloured tights wearers from the early days of TNA, so you can't win them all. Bradley's in-ring career wrapped up in 2009, but as a nod to his trainers, his final 2 matches came in 2010 and 2013, and will be Battle Royal appearances at an annual event held to honour Boris Malenko. Next, we get to Snot Dudley, real name Michael Deek. Like Jeff Bradley, Deek also entered wrestling in '93, trained by former WCW and WWE wrestler Tim Horner. As you can likely guess by the name, there wasn't much to the Snot gimmick, other than he would regularly be seen picking his nose. I wonder how much of this was Raven's input, given especially during his grunge era, one of Raven's trademark spots would be to use what he called a snot rag as a weapon, essentially a dirty hanky used in the way Mr. Socko would be later on. Around this time, the Dudleys were often used as lackeys for Raven, before he later had a flock of his own. Before ECW, Deek would wrestle mainly for Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling under the name Anthony Michaels. Also at this time, he was one of the Masked Infernos, sometimes wrestling as both on the same night. I hope you paid him twice, Corny. Snot would debut for ECW at Hardcore Heaven 1995, teaming with Dudley Dudley, also making his in-ring debut, in a 6-minute loss to the Pitbulls. Unfortunately for Deek though, he would only wrestle one more match for ECW 2 weeks later at Heatwave. Following this, Deek would be involved in a jet ski accident, though in storyline ECW claimed that the Pitbulls had injured him. After his accident, it would take Deek 16 months to return to wrestling. spending the next few years working mainly in Florida, still using the Snot Dudley name and teaming with a wrestler called Schmuck Dudley, real name Jeff Roth, who as far as I can tell never worked for ECW, so is technically a non-canon Dudley. I bet you didn't know that was a thing, did you? Kinda like all those fake Doink the Clowns that were spreading like herpes in the 90s. Anyway, Snot would drop the Dudley name in July of 1999, not long before Bubba and Devon joined WWE. This may have been due to WWE trademarking the name, which annoyingly nobody in ECW had thought to do, resulting in the name change to Team 3D when Brother Ray and Brother Devon, spelled differently for legal reasons, arrived in TNA in 2005. The former Snot wrestled as Anthony Michaels until 2013 on the indie scene, but would occasionally wrestle matches until 2020 for Connecticut-based Test of Strength Wrestling. As best I can tell, Deke's one and only match for a national promotion came on the March 13, 2007 episode, ironically, of ECW on Sci-Fi, where he and another wrestler would lose a 30-second squash match to Gene Snitsky. Next, we get the enforcer of the family, Big Dick Dudley. Born in 1968, Alexander Rizzo was the oldest of the Dudley clan, well, the oldest real one at least. He entered wrestling in the late 80s, trained by WWE Hall of Famer and legendary enhancement talent Johnny Rodz, at the same time as Taz. Rodz would go on to train many more successful wrestlers, including Tommy Dreamer, Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley. Billed at 6'7" and 320 pounds, Rizzo would wrestle on the East Coast Indies under the name Alexander the Great, before being recruited to join the Dudley clan in '95. He would join the group in August and would gradually take on an outside-the-ring leadership role after Dudley's departure. Later on, when Bubba and Devon became the stars of the group, Dick would always be seen in the background, assisting them in their many ECW tag title reigns. The three of them would become the figureheads of the heel version of the group, once the more comedic Dudleys had gone. During his time in ECW, Rizzo's highest profile match would be his only pay-per-view appearance in his career. Incidentally, on one of ECW's most beloved events ever, Heatwave 1998. In the main event on the night, Bubba, Devon and Big Dick would lose a street fight to Spike Dudley, the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer. While on the surface Rizzo appeared content to stand behind his on-screen brothers, in reality he grew more and more unhappy at not getting opportunities for himself. This would eventually cause a dispute with Paul Heyman over the direction of his push, and in 1999 Rizzo would leave ECW. Perhaps in an attempt to further slight Heyman, Rizzo would join West Coast-based Extreme Pro Wrestling, even becoming their world champion. XPW being the massively controversial promotion owned by Rob Black, which had been born of Black's own feeling of being slighted by Paul Heyman. The promotion was, in part, an attempt to recreate and surpass what ECW was doing. Thus, Black would look to book as many Paul Heyman guys as possible, jumping at the chance to steal Big Dick Dudley, who continued to wrestle under that name until the end of his career. Sadly, in May of 2002, Rizzo would pass away in his own home at the age of 34. The cause of death was claimed to be kidney failure, possibly brought on by an addiction to painkillers. I apologise for the abrupt shift in tone as we move on now, but the next Dudley on the list was one of the more comical of the group. The brilliantly named Dancers with Dudley. DW, or Chief Dudley for short, was brought into ECW in 1995 to replace Snot following his jet ski accident. In canon, he was the result of Daddy Dudley's exploits in Cheyenne, Oklahoma, which is where the fun and games end, as Cheyenne is commonly associated with the Battle of Washita River in 1868, which makes for some fascinating but bleak reading, by the way. To be fair, the man who portrayed Dancers with Dudley, Adolfo Bermudez, also hailed from Oklahoma. He debuted in wrestling in 1992 using the name White Cloud, teaming with a wrestler going by Dancing Wolf as the Sioux War Party. Dancing Wolf would go on to have a much longer career, wrestling even today as Prince Al Farhat. In his ECW run, Bermudez would only wrestle on TV twice, and would twice challenge for the ECW tag titles, losing both to the Pitbulls and Mikey Whipwreck and Cactus Jack. He would allegedly leave ECW on bad terms following a dispute with Paul Heyman, and would continue to use the gimmick under the radar until his retirement. Right after leaving ECW, he would complete a tour with Big Japan Wrestling, where he would even compete in some death matches. In the latter years of his career, Bermudez would work in smaller US indies, largely in the New York area, before retiring in 2004. According to a 2020 article by Ring the Damn Bell, Adolfo now lives in Long Island and works a city job. Next, we have another of the more eccentric Dudleys, Chubby Dudley, who was played by Bay Ragney. Bay had competed in Todd Gordon's original Eastern Championship Wrestling, the precursor to Heyman's Extreme version, as Easy Rider as early as '92, and had debuted on the indie circuit a year earlier. Chubby seems to have only wrestled sporadically, and said on the Perched on the Top Rope podcast last year that he left because he wasn't happy with how little he got to wrestle, and he also claimed that Taz threatened him for using the Dudley name outside of ECW. Aside from his time in ECW, Bay Ragney had a hand in promoting Liberty All-Star Wrestling from '94 to 2002, almost as long as ECW existed, while wrestling sporadically under the Easy Rider name until 2005. I'd also like to draw your attention to Bay's fairly new YouTube channel, React and Chill with Chubby Dudley, where he reacts to mostly old ECW footage. I promise you Bubba Ray and Devon are up soon, but this is an interesting one. Sign Guy Dudley, real name Lou D'Angeli, began life as the Pro Dudley's plant in the crowd. He would dress like the Dudleys and carry signs before eventually being introduced as part of the family. Despite being in the background of many a Dudley Boyz promo, he would never speak a word, only communicating through his signs. The in-storyline reason for this was that Sign Guy was born of Daddy Dudley's time in an insane asylum, according to Dudley Dudley. Sign Guy never actually wrestled as a Dudley, but had 2 matches later in ECW as Lou E. Dangerously, a blatant parody of Paul Heyman, hinting at his old WCW name, Paul E. Dangerously. Post ECW, not being an active wrestler, Lou would make occasional appearances as manager. But in a first for this channel, my resource for his latter-day career comes from Lou's own LinkedIn page. He worked for a few years in WWE's marketing department, before spending 11 years working for Cirque du Soleil. During this time, not mentioned on his LinkedIn, he was also attached to Chicago-based Resistance Pro Wrestling, the oft-forgotten first attempt of Billy Corgan to get into the wrestling business. In an interesting turn of events, Lou currently works as Vice President of Marketing for Anthem Entertainment, the company that essentially saved Impact Wrestling. I know you're likely waiting for me to get on with it at this point, but there's another man who deserves to be acknowledged in this video. A man of many nicknames, the most relevant being Studley Dudley. It is he, the quintessential stud muffin, Joel Gertner. Joel entered the wrestling business in 1992 as a heel ring announcer. According to Joel, he took a few classes at a wrestling school, but knew the in-ring life wouldn't be for him, using them to get a foot in the door. Gertner would arrive in ECW in 1995 as a ring announcer, notable for introducing luchadors in perfect Spanish. He would also make fun of some of the babyfaces in his intros, and they would make sure that he paid for it. At Barely Legal 97, ECW's first pay-per-view, while announcing for the Dudleys, he would take the Eliminator's finisher, Total Elimination, a leg sweep head kick combination. From this day on for the rest of his career, Joel would wear a neck brace following this move. Joel would eventually become the personal ring announcer for the Dudleys, adding a whole new colourful flavour to their presentation, announcing Devon specifically as slim, trim, buff, cut, rough, chiseled, and jacked. Joel was never afraid of saying the filthiest one-liners he could, which eventually turned him face with the ECW crowd, none of which I can give examples of on YouTube, but they're out there. Once Bubba, Devon and Big Dick left in '99, Joel joined the previously solo voice of ECW on commentary, Joey Styles. The two played off each other in an interesting way, with Joey being the clean-cut announcer, while Joel tried his best to be funny. Maybe his best work in ECW was his ongoing feud with Cyrus the Virus, now known as Don Callis, eventually leading to a match between the two at Anarchy Rules 2000, where Joel would defeat the network stooge. Since ECW closed, Joel has made occasional TV appearances, but seems to have continued on the indie level. In the early days of TNA, he managed a tag team called the Rainbow Express, a short-lived, clearly gay tag team designed to draw heat from the Alabama crowds. Thankfully, times have moved on since those days. Joel also appeared on ECW One Night Stand 2005, approaching Eric Bischoff in his skybox, begging for a job, only for Eric to reject and humiliate him. Ever since, Joel has continued to make indie appearances and has had a run in podcasting. Alright, we're finally here. Bubba Ray Dudley, born Mark LaMonaco, who had become the Dudley to wrestle the most matches, with over 2,000 on record, and the only Dudley still actively wrestling as of this video being made. Bubba Ray was trained by Johnny Rodz, who I mentioned earlier, in 1991, and pre-ECW would have a biker gimmick, wrestling under the name Mongo Vile. In late 95, he would receive a tryout from ECW, in which he would act as a bodyguard for Bill Alfonso, and would take a chokeslam from 911. A rite of passage of sorts in early ECW. From there, Mark would be hired a month later, and he would first appear as the stuttering redneck Bubba Ray, though his first ECW TV match would occur in January 96. His name came from the stuttering gimmick he debuted with, which he would stop doing later when the group would become more serious heels, but briefly brought it back in his early WWE run. The stuttering act is also why you sometimes see his name spelled phonetically as Bubba Ray, as the name was meant to be a pun on his stutter. Originally, the Dudleys were heel lackeys for Raven, but they would leave him in early 96. Bubba would come around at a time when they were more becoming fun babyfaces, and would even dance in the ring. Anyone who was surprised and confused by Bubba's brief dancing gimmick in 2002 when he was separated from Devon by the draft clearly never saw his early ECW work. It does make me laugh to think how, in storyline, Bubba reacted to the enforced split by becoming a dancer, and Devon handled it by becoming an evil reverend. Wrestling writers. The fun, comical direction the Dudleys had grown into would be the setup for Devon to come in and change the dynamic again, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Bubba's God-given talent for drawing hatred from any crowd he stood in front of with a microphone. Bubba would cross any line he could to goad fans into a frenzy in his pre-match promos. The most famous of these was at Heatwave 99 on pay-per-view, where Bubba incensed the crowd with such a vulgar promo that many thought a riot might happen. I can't quote much of it here, but the unedited promo still exists on the UK version of the network, so I presume it's on Peacock as well. A lesser talked about promo from Bubba led to a fan actually jumping from the balcony of the Manhattan Center to try and get to fight Bubba. Even back then, the future Bully Ray knew how to win enemies and certainly influence people. To quote another ECW icon, Taz, the mood is about to change, as we now get to Devon Dudley. Much like Bubba Ray, Devon Hughes would be trained by Johnny Rodz and would enter wrestling in 91. He would begin his career using the name A-Train, not that one. Even in his ECW tryout, a tag team loss to the Eliminators in March of 96. 1 month later, he would make his debut as Devon Dudley, a character inspired by Samuel L. Jackson's Bible-quoting hitman character in Pulp Fiction. A little bit of this persists in Devon's character through the years. Oh my brother, testify. Aside from this influence, Devon's father was a bishop and his mother was a pastor, so he was no doubt familiar with religion in his household. In his debut promo, Devon even introduced 3 commandments: thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not f*** with the Dudleys. Unlike his brothers, Devon had no comedic edge to him at all, and he appeared to be disgusted by his brother's antics. which would lead him to feud with Bubba Ray through '96, culminating in a match at the November to Remember pay-per-view, where Bubba would win. On the way to this match, at an event called Fight the Power on June 1st, '96, Devon would attack Bubba, as well as Chubby and Dances with Dudley with a chair, taking the latter two out of the group, and making Bubba into a more serious competitor. On February 1st, 1997, at Crossing the Line Again, Bubba Ray would turn heel on the last remaining Dudley I haven't got to yet, forming the new serious version of the group I've been talking about with Devon, Big Dick, Sign Guy and the manager Joe Gertner. Bubba and Devon would hit Spike with what would become one of the most famous tag team finishes ever. Up there with the Demolition Decapitation, the Doomsday Device, the Dudley Death Drop, more commonly known as the 3D. Talking to Chris Van Vliet, Bubba Ray would claim that he was inspired by watching a WCW match between Dean Malenko and Rey Mysterio, in which Dean launched Ray into the air, and that made him wonder what would happen if you added a diamond cutter on the way down. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, he explains it much better. He also noted that Spike served as the crash test dummy for the move, taking it over and over in training until they perfected it. While battling with Spike throughout the next 2 years, Devon and Bubba would also win a record-setting 8 ECW Tag Team Championships between '97 and '99. The two would go on to win essentially every tag title they ever competed for the next decade. In late '99, just as ECW gained its TNN deal, the Dudleys and Taz were signed to WWE. 3 of ECW's biggest stars, who were very much missed once they left. I won't go into their post-ECW careers here, as this video would go on for hours, but their legend only grew after leaving ECW. Finally, we get to the run to the litter, Little Spike Dudley. Let's get this out of the way early on. Little Spike Dudley was not just the smallest Dudley, but he also got his name as an acronym. I'll let you do the Steiner maths from there. Matt Hyson, born in Rhode Island and already working as a school teacher, would make the trek to California to train in wrestling with APW in 1993, at the age of 23. APW, by the way, is one of the promotions featured in the '99 film Beyond the Mat, especially featuring a wrestler Hyson worked with, Michael Modest. He would train initially as a manager and referee, presumably due to his size, as the idea that pro wrestlers should be big as houses was still prevalent until the mid-90s. Regardless, Hyson soon began training to wrestle too, working mostly on California indies. He would arrive in ECW in September of '96. As Little Spike Dudley, he would enter ECW as a fan favourite, seen to be the runt of the litter, later referenced in his TNA name, Brother Runt. In February '97, things would drastically change for Spike, when Bubba would turn to the dark side of the Dudleys by joining Devon and attacking Spike, leading to 2 years of brutal matches with Spike and various partners facing Bubba and Devon. For one typical example of how brutal this feud got, search out the particularly violent match involving New Jack at Guilty as Charged '99. During this time, while not warring with his brothers, Spike also gained a reputation as a giant killer, sometimes defeating much larger men than himself. Spike even earned a shocking victory over former ECW World Champion Bam Bam Bigelow. The two would also be part of an iconic ECW moment on September 23rd, '97, at an event called As Good As It Gets, where Bam Bam would gorilla press Spike above his head, launch him over ringside and into the crowd, instead of carefully escorting Spike back to the ground like good, caring citizens. The ECW faithful would proceed to body surf the 150-pound Dudley around the building. Spike's giant killer reputation would eventually lead to a trilogy of the most aggressive ECW World title matches ever, starting at Guilty as Charged 2000, where Spike would challenge ECW champion Mike Awesome. The 3 world title matches were stunning, and I detailed them further in another video on this channel. When Bubba and Devon left in late '99, Spike and new partner Balls Mahoney would get the final win over his brothers to prevent them from taking the ECW tag titles to WWE. Spike would stick around until the end of ECW, spending much of that time as the on-screen commissioner while nursing a broken leg, though this didn't stop him from getting into the action every now and again. When ECW closed its doors in 2001, Spike was one of the ones left behind at the end. On the final ECW show from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Spike would lose an ECW World title match against Rhino. 2 months later, on the March 19th, 2001 episode of Raw, Spike would make his WWE debut, helping Bubba Ray and Devon beat Edge and Christian for the tag titles. So that's all of the original Dudley Boyz. There were some one-time deals and knockoffs, such as the Bushwhackers being honorary Dudleys, but I've talked about all the main ECW ones. Let's talk about the future now. As far as I'm aware, there are only 2 next-generation Dudleys wrestling today: Terrence and Terrell Hughes, the sons of Devon Dudley. Terrence and Terrell were sometimes seen on AEW Dark during the pandemic-era Daily's Place shows. Since then, they've wrestled for indies under the name TNT, with their highest profile match being a first-round Crockett Cup loss for the NWA. Looking at their cage match stats, they're somewhat active, wrestling 13 matches so far this year, more often than the 7 they had through 2022. They did, it seems, for a few years wrestle under the Dudley name. They seem to prefer going by their given names. Now, I'm no expert in this, but I don't think WWE can trademark an entire surname like Dudley, just the individual names of Bubba, Devon and Spike. Therefore, I suppose they could continue the Dudley tradition if they chose to, but like I said, I could be wrong about that. This poses the question, could there ever be a Dudley Boyz reboot of some kind? Well, it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. Stranger things have happened in wrestling after all. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.